get going here in the essence of time. We have a lot of information to go through. For those who don't know me, I'm Representative Michelle McGraw. I'm the representative for Little Compton. And I really want to thank you all for joining us. I want to start with a little bit of housekeeping, just so that everybody knows the restrooms are through the entryway that you came in, just to the right, should you need restrooms. And there are exits to the back of the room on either side, and to the left here at the back of the back of the room here. So just a little bit of housekeeping. I want to thank the Rhode Island Committee of the New England for Offshore Wind Coalition and their partners for helping to develop this program, to bring the information to us and to answer our questions. I especially want to thank the Wilbur and McMahon schools for opening their doors to us on short notice. Many of you may know that this event has pretty much tripled in size in the past week. We thought this was going to be a small, intimate gathering in the community center, but there was just such an outpouring of demand for information on offshore wind that the school was gracious enough to work with us to expand the program. So I really want to thank them, and again, just be a little bit patient with us. We've been very fortunate to have a couple of boards up, so hopefully you'll be able to see the presentations well enough. But a big shout out and thank you to them, and thank you to the Little Compton Police and Fire for joining us tonight for safety. This is a very large crowd, and so I just wanted to make sure that we are being as safe and respectful to everyone as we can. With the multiple renewable energy proposals that are so close to our community, I was hearing from a lot of you, a lot of questions about offshore wind, about the process, about the approvals, and about the potential impacts on our environment. And with so many questions, I really wanted to look to the experts to find out. I mean, I'm a pharmacist, right? So I know medications and drugs, but I know that there are people who spend their entire lives, their entire careers studying offshore wind, studying wildlife, studying energy, and just as I would expect them to come to me if they had questions about medication, I was happy to be able to defer to them when it comes to questions about energy and wildlife and offshore wind. So a big thank you to them for being here tonight. A little bit more housekeeping. We are passing out note cards so that if anybody has questions that they would like to submit to the panel, we're going to do that. Again, it's a large crowd, and we want to be respectful of everyone's time and make sure that we don't have duplications in question, but make sure that we have enough time to get to everyone's questions. So if you have a particular question you would like to ask the panel, there are volunteers around the room that will make sure that you have access to an index card and a pen, and we can submit it. If there are questions that don't get answered by the end, we'll make sure that we get to all of those in another manner. This program, for everyone's reference, will be available on YouTube. It's going to be recorded, so it'll be available on the Audubon Society of Rhode Island's YouTube channel. They're also going to make available the slide presentation, so that if you see something up here and you want to make sure you have access to that information, the slide presentation will be available after the presentation. And so after the event, I will be posting on my webpage, which is McGaw4ri.com. I'll post links to the YouTube recording and to the slide presentation so that you'll have all of that. So tonight I've invited this knowledgeable and experienced panel to speak with us, and I'm really excited to hear their insights on the aspects of offshore wind, the things that they work most closely with, and I'm so glad they're here to answer the questions for our community. Our program tonight will be co-moderated by Priscilla De La Cruz. Priscilla is the Senior Director of Government Affairs at the Audubon Society of Rhode Island. She's President of the Environmental Council of Rhode Island and co-chair of Climate Jobs Rhode Island. And it's co-emceed by Amanda Barker, who is the Policy Associate of Green Energy Consumers Alliance and the Rhode Island State Lead for the New England Offshore Wind Coalition. Tonight, we are going to hear from experts across the spectrum of those with a deep-seated knowledge of this topic. Our panelists tonight include Timmons Roberts, who is an environmental studies and sociology professor at Brown University. Mike Rolls, the Climate Jobs Rhode Island Policy Director. Captain Dave Monty, a charter captain, fishing writer and advocate, and vice chair of the Rhode Island Marine Fisheries Council. Amber Hewitt, from the Offshore Wind Energy she's the Offshore Wind Energy Program Director at the National Wildlife Federation. Shiloh Felton is the Senior Scientist at Renewable Energy Wildlife Institute, and Bob Kenny, who's an oceanographer at the University of Rhode Island. Each panelist will present for 10 minutes, and there will be an opportunity after the presentations to ask questions. As I mentioned, there will be index cards available, so just please raise your hand to one of the volunteers. With that, I'm going to keep it short because we have a lot of information to go over. So I'm going to hand over the microphone to our MCs for the evening, Amanda Barker and Priscilla De La Cruz.
Thank you, Representative McGraw, and thank you all for being here tonight. As Rep. McGraw said, my name is Amanda Barker. I am the Policy Advocate at Green Energy Consumers Alliance, as well as the Rhode Island State Lead for the New England for Offshore Wind Coalition. We are a regional coalition of environment and justice organizations, academic and research institutions, businesses, and labor unions, and we advocate for the responsible development of offshore wind. We put together this event where anyone can come learn about offshore wind from experts in the field. I know that there are some differences of opinion in the room tonight, but I think we can all agree that climate change is a threat to Rhode Island and that we need to do something. Doing nothing is not an option. So we ask that you remain respectful and open to having a discussion about offshore wind and hearing from experts in the field. We really appreciate you all being here tonight and your willingness to learn about offshore wind. With that, I would like to introduce our first presenter tonight, Professor Timmons Roberts from Brown University.
If I should bring the microphone up a little bit. Good evening. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm honored. And thank you, Representative McGraw, for organizing this event. And this is what I love about Rhode Island, is that we come together and we can talk to each other. That is, we are a small enough place that we know each other in different ways, and we're not just, living at the other end of, at two separate, ends of the world. So. I am a professor at Brown University. I've been here for 14 years. I've been working on climate change for 32 years, literally my whole career, about climate change policy and how we're going to solve this problem. I also want to give a shout out to my students who came today and are working in my climate and development lab. So I'm really glad to have them here. You'll see them, maybe they're handing out cards or swiping you in or something like that. So, can you see these slides at all? Sort of? Okay, so all the work on the slides, oh well. So, I have a little slide here about my climate and development lab. How am I going to advance this thing? Wow. Somehow this screen went out of the presentation. Oh, there. Okay, now we just go there. Okay. So my climate and development lab develops projects with partners, and then we work in teams of students, faculty, postdoctoral research fellows, doctoral students. We then do initial releases, often in policy briefings, often with those partners, and then we blog and tweet, and we have events where we roll out those outputs, and then we take on input from the world, and then we try to make it better and put it out in scientific articles. I have 3 points tonight about offshore wind and climate change. And the first point is that climate change, that urgent climate change is needed, and it needs to be done by us. So climate change is a global challenge, of course, right? Everybody needs to act. But some, of course, are more responsible for the problem and more capable of responding to it. So the Earth has already warmed over 1 degree Celsius, that's almost 2 degrees Fahrenheit, since the 19th century when we started taking records. And it was quite stable for a very long time before that. That is, our temperature and levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere were stable for hundreds of thousands of years, and now we're in a different period entirely. You can't really see this graph on the left, shows that the temperatures in carbon dioxide have cycled, but they've cycled at a whole different range than we are headed into right now. We were at 260 parts per million, now we're over 412, and we're headed in the wrong direction. And some of the reasons are right here, of course, in Rhode Island. That is our industrial and transportation buildings and our cars. So there's clearer evidence than ever. Temperatures are up, again, over this 1 degree Celsius. The point that came out in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, which came out a summary of their large assessment report based on thousands and thousands of scientific studies in the peer-reviewed literature and summarized today and released in Switzerland, talked about how bad this is going and we are not acting fast enough, and that we have to rapidly make the transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy. And we need to do it in the next 20 or 30 years. And we need to get a big down payment on that in the next 10 years. So this is from the Emission Gap Report, which shows that we are not on track to keep our world safe for our children and our grandchildren. That is, the lines at the top are showing where policies and actions are now. That is, the increase has stopped or largely stopped in emissions of greenhouse gases, but we're not making the huge cuts in emissions. That is, we're sort of stuck at a high level. But we need to make emissions reductions of probably 50% by 2030. Sorry, the last slide was about how 1.5 degrees of warming is bad, and 2 degrees of warming is really bad. We're going to have things like 440 million people exposed to severe drought, destabilization of food systems, sea level rise, threatening all that we care about in Rhode Island. Here's an assessment tool called the Climate Action Tracker, which I recommend from a series of modeling groups and scientists in Europe. And it evaluates how countries are doing on their climate pledges and on their climate policies and actions. And unfortunately, on the right, it shows that the United States is on a list of insufficient. That is, we're doing a little better, but we're still highly insufficient in how we're doing on climate change. This thermometer thing, which I encourage you to look at climateactiontracker.org, shows how, in fact, we're probably going to 2.5 or 3 degrees of warming. The pledges and so on might keep us to 2 degrees. That is, if countries actually follow through on their pledges that they've made, including in the Paris Agreement. This is an interesting slide that shows, if you're not counting on removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, then you really have to reduce your emissions fast. That a lot of the modeling, including that done by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, includes assumptions that we're going to suck all this carbon out of the atmosphere. It's much easier and cheaper and affordable and technologically feasible to keep it out of the atmosphere, not to try to remove it from the atmosphere later. So I recommend this guy, Glenn Peters. He's at the Cicero Institute in Norway and an amazing climate modeler. It shows, these are quite unrealistic expectations of being able to remove carbon from the atmosphere. We'd have to take over huge swaths of farmland, convert them to forests, or to other crops that then we collect and burn and sequester the carbon underground, which is expensive, requires a lot of energy to do that, and it's often it's unfeasible and it's inexpensive. So the first point was urgent climate action is needed by us. The second point is that Rhode Island will suffer from climate change. Oh, there's a slide that didn't get in the version that I had here. I had another slide. I knew there was one more. And that was, why us? And this is where I think we can't assume that somebody else is going to do this for us. Rhode Island, yeah, we're a small state, but we're also in the wealthiest part of the country, of probably the wealthiest country on earth that is most responsible for climate change. And the pictures that I have of people in shacks that have been hit by hurricanes, living in shacks, you know, tin shacks that have been devastated, hundreds of thousands of people dying from hurricanes and so on. And then other pictures of the UN negotiations. I, for years, brought groups of brown students to the UN climate negotiations. And they saw for themselves how difficult this process is to get all 195 countries in the world to agree on something like this. It's damn hard. And a lot of countries are saying, why should we act if the wealthiest and most powerful country is not acting? And so anyway, I'm not laying on a guilt trip. I'm saying, well, this is our responsibility and we can do this. We're Americans, we figure out stuff and we don't say we can't do it. So Rhode Island's going to suffer from climate change and we can benefit from large-scale deployment of offshore wind. Climate change is happening here. I was appointed by Governor Raimondo and Governor McKee to be on the Science and Technology Advisory Board of the Executive Climate Change Coordinating Council. That's the interagency panel that's helping the state plan what it's going to do about climate change. And we did a summary report in which we summarized the science, and I was on the group that did rising temperatures. And I also have worked with a professor in public health and a doctoral student named Melissa Elliott, who did a lot of this work, showing that in fact this is our number of days above 80 heat index, 90 heat index, and over 100 heat index. The area on the left is back in the 1950s and 60s, when it used to be about 45 to 50 days over 80 heat index, and now we're over 75 or 80 days. This is just a thermometer at TF Green Airport. The climate is changing, it's changing here, it's getting hot. I did a new graph in the later version that I thought I had sent, and I'm sorry that didn't get through, showing that in fact the days over 100 are especially rising in the last 10 or 15 years. So our climate is changing. It's also worse for some people than others. I'm running out of time. It's a big risk for coastal Rhode Island, right? We have 400 miles of coast, and especially down here in this part of the state. I'm worried about transit and so on. How are people going to get out? We have a lot to benefit if we do act on climate change. This is a graph showing how much we spend on fossil fuels in the state of Rhode Island. It's about $4 billion a year, and that's money that's just pouring through our fingers and going to other states. It's going to Pennsylvania, it's going to big oil companies who are lying to us about the reality of climate change. Rhode Island should be a climate leader. We have a lot to benefit if we produce our energy here. This is a slide showing the life cycle costs of offshore wind, which averages, I added another thing on here, I'm very sorry. Offshore wind releases about 12 grams of CO2 in its life cycle. That's in every stage, from manufacturing of wind turbines, transportation, operation, and dismantling and disposal, 12. Natural gas is about 500. So it's about 50 times better over the life cycle of a wind turbine. The last point, and I'm sorry I'm going over time, offshore wind is the only resource that we have at scale in Rhode Island and in New England on the grid on which we operate to allow us to decarbonize at the rate that science says is needed, right? So I've talked about the science and how fast we have to do this. I rehired, with a little bit of money I asked for from our president at Brown, Christina Paxson. We hired a consultant, not a lot of money. I think he lost money on this study. It's in 2019. It's at the Stockholm Environment Institute webpage. You can look it up. And we redid the models from the 2016 plan that the state submitted as part of its requirements. The Stockholm Environment Institute is an independent research firm. They help countries all over the world develop climate plans. So we went back through the The 2016 plan, sorry, I'm rushing, we included all kinds of economic and technology factors, environmental, time, geographic, and sectors, and so on. And here's the bottom line. That if we're going to decarbonize, we have to increase our electricity production by about twofold, because all of our cars, our houses, will be running on electricity if we're not burning fossil fuels. We can do this, we have the technology, but we're gonna have to produce more electricity. And even if we don't, we do need to get off of natural gas, which is now 55% of our electricity sector, right? Over half of our electricity is produced by burning natural gas, which also leaks methane, which is highly problematic for climate change. So when we put in the technology that's available right now to address this problem, offshore wind was the one thing that could be scaled up and was technologically and economically feasible. That is, it basically took up about half the slack in how much electricity and energy we needed to produce. There's lots more details on that study. I'm happy to share it. And so those are my 3 points about offshore wind, namely, I hope I have this version, yes. Urgent climate action is needed. It has to be by us. We can't expect somebody else to do this for us. Rhode Island will suffer from climate change, and we can benefit from large-scale deployment of offshore wind. And offshore wind is the only resource that we have at scale to allow the decarbonization that science says is needed. I am a professor. I don't make any money from offshore wind. In fact, I was offered a consulting job a few weeks ago for an offshore wind company. And so I don't have a stake in that game. I do have a stake in my children's future, and I think you're going to hear a lot more about other reasons why this is a good idea, not the idea, not a bad idea. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Timmons. Next up, we have Mike Rolls, the Policy Director at Climate Jobs Rhode Island.
I wonder if I can make space here. Good evening. My name is Mike Rolls. I am the Policy Director with Climate Jobs Rhode Island. For those that aren't familiar, we're a coalition of more than 30 organizations, labor unions, including the building trades, who represent workers who build our infrastructure, and environmental groups that include Audubon Society, the Nature Conservancy, and community groups like Childhood Action Project, United Way, many more to include in that. But I just wanted to start with a story. We all remember the Great Recession. It wasn't that long ago. And Rhode Islanders do remember how bad we really had it, how hard our state was hit. And as the saying goes, Rhode Island is usually the first into a recession and the last out. And only a few years after that fallout, Rhode Island became the first state to build an offshore wind farm. And during this time, a worker who was moving through a trades apprenticeship program was on the verge of homelessness. And by the time he completed his work, he was able to use that income that he earned from that wind project to buy his first home. Last year, Climate Jobs issued a report. You'll see it on our website, climatejobsri.org. And we did a little bit of analysis on jobs created through clean energy investments, costs, benefits, impacts, the kinds of trades and skills that would go into that work, whether you're an iron worker, or you're a painter, or a glazer, or a builder, or a carpenter, etc. You'll all see it on that report. In that report, we talked about offshore wind, and we found that about 3.5 direct jobs are created per $1 million invested, and another 3.2 indirect jobs are created for that same $1 million. And there's a sort of a chain of events that happens among the workforce within those investments. When we invest in offshore wind, it means thousands and thousands of jobs, particularly with the projects that we're expecting. And many more stories like that worker's life-changing stories for workers who depend on this. And when you go through a workforce training program, an apprenticeship program to go into these trades, to go into these skills, college might not be for you, might not be what you want to do. You go into a trade program, an apprenticeship program, you go into a pre-apprenticeship program if you're not so, caught up on the actual work itself, right? You go through the program. During that entire time, you earn while you learn. So unlike college where you're paying money, you're earning money to go through that apprenticeship program, the pre-apprenticeship program and the apprenticeship program. And it is really life-changing for many people. When you go through that apprenticeship, you do projects, right? That's the only way you're going to be able to get the skills and the trades you need. You need those projects. And thinking about the clean energy work that's coming, there are a lot of apprentices ready to do that work, to earn that living, to go into those careers and have that career for the rest of their life, to buy those homes, to feed their families, to get out of the social safety nets that we all need to provide for our own communities. Investing in clean energy not only will safeguard our future, but it also means life-changing opportunities for Rhode Islanders. And maybe this time, Rhode Island won't be the first in and last out. This work means a lot to people like that worker. And when we invest in a clean energy future, we're investing in our future, we're investing in people, and therefore we're investing in our communities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. Next up, we have Captain Dave Monty. He is a charter captain, fishing writer, and fishing advocate, and vice chair of the Rhode Island Marine Fisheries Council.
Hi everyone. It's great to be here. See if we can move this up just a bit. There we go. Fishing among giants is something that I'd like to talk about tonight because I certainly have done plenty of that out at the Block Island Wind Farm anyway. And my comments are going to be focusing on that because that's the only wind farm that I know. And as you know, it actually served as a pilot project for all the other wind farms in this nation. It's been studied. There are hundreds and hundreds of studies that have been done on Block Island. Bird studies, electromagnetics, habitat studies, fish trawl studies, and I'm going to sort of highlight a few of those. So I always like that, fishing among giants. By the way, everyone that I bring out to the Block Island Wind Farm, or if I'm even 5 miles from it in my vessel, everyone insists I'm going to see the wind farm. They're really taken back by the majestic turning of the turbines. People seem to really, really like them. Just a little quick thing on my background. I'm not an academic, so my credentials are my involvement in the fishing community. And as the folks suggested, I'm vice chair of something called the Rhode Island Marine Fisheries Council, which regulates commercial and recreational fishing in Rhode Island. It makes regulation recommendations, that is the DEM. I'm also a vice chair of the Narragansett Bay Estuary Program, and I'm a past second vice president of the Rhode Island Saltwater Anglers, which is a great group, by the way. We just completed our fishing show at the Convention Center. I'm also on the board of the American Saltwater Guides Association and the Party and Charter Boat Association. And I'm a fishing writer in this community. I actually write for the East Bay newspapers, and I've done that for a number of years, a weekly fishing column, but I also write for the Providence Journal and 11 other newspapers and blogs. The wind farms off Rhode Island and Massachusetts, you can see number one, which is this little spot right there. That's the Block Island Wind Farm. Number 2 is the Revolution Wind Farm. 3 is South Fork, which is coming online next. And I believe 5, the green one, is Vineyard Wind, and those are the ones that are coming online soon. But I did want to talk about the Rhode Island. I'm having trouble moving the slides. Oh, that's good. Great. So fishing in the Block Island Wind Farm is what I'm going to focus comments on. And you can actually see some of these fish. These codfish caught right in the Block Island Wind Farm since it was built. There's an abundance of black sea bass close to the turbines and in the general area. There's more codfish. Summer flounder is a very popular species that was caught there before and after. Summer flounder is commonly called fluke. More black sea bass. This is Mike Wade of Watch Hill Outfitters with a nice fluke caught in the wind farm area. And commercial fishers fish there too. Bob Murray is on the left-hand side, and Bob is a commercial rod and reeler. And this is typically what you see in the wind farm. Even exotic warm water fish have been becoming more common. This is a mahi-mahi. That's Captain Chris Willey, who has a charter business right on Block Island. And in part, the reason that there are so many fish in the general area is that as a charter captain and recreational fisherman, I spend most of my time looking for structure and fishing around structure. And that means natural structure, such things as ledges, channel breaks, deep holes, rock clusters, and then artificial structure too, bridge abutments, jetties, ocean platforms, and artificial reefs, because this is where there's a lot of growth, a lot of habitat. This is where the small fish hang out, and this is where the large fish hang out to capture the small fish, if you would. And I know of no structure that is bad for fishing, honestly. And this is why. You can see this is a pylon of the Block Island Wind Farm, one of the pylons, and you can see the mussel growth. Within 3 to 6 months, this mussel growth was on the pylons. And you can see some small fish here feeding off of the pylons. And you can see larger fish. If you have divers sent down and look at some detailed videos, you see the larger fish like striped bass and bluefish circling to pick off the smaller fish. So this habitat creation on the turbines itself flakes off, falls to the bottom, and creates additional habitat as well. Emma, I'm still having trouble with this. Oh, okay, great. So the Block Island Wind Farm was done right with research from commercial and recreational anglers to guarantee its success. What I mean by that, research was done before, during, and after construction. And that's important so that you can see if there are any changes in fish or habitat. The Southern New England Offshore Wind Energy Science Forum, Jen McCann from Sea Grant is in the audience here. It's one of her programs where over 50 scientists presented their studies on the Block Island Wind Farm. Again, acoustics, electromagnetics, habitat studies, fish studies, and basically the conclusion was there were no remarkable adverse effects on the environment, fish habitat, or mammals. However, scientists did warn about a cumulative impact of multiple wind farms, and that's something that I can address in a moment. One study that addresses cumulative impacts is a peer-reviewed study called Meta-Analysis of Fish in Abundance at Offshore Wind Farms, done in Europe by a NOAA scientist. And here they took over 50 studies, and if they were peer-reviewed, and if they studied a species in a wind farm area that was also studied in control areas, it was included in the study. And they concluded that in European wind farms, fish abundance is greater in wind farms than in control areas outside of wind farms. And this is what we found at the Block Island Wind Farm. So much so that at the Block Island Wind Farm, there's about a 200% increase in fishing pressure because now it's a destination. Where are you going to go fishing? I'm going to go to the Block Island Wind Farm. Where there were 5 boats on the south side of Block Island, before the wind farm was built. Now I go there, there are 50, 60, 70, some days over 100 boats fishing in that area. A 7-year study was just completed at the Block Island Wind Farm. It was conducted a couple of years before the wind farm was built, during construction and after. And this was a trawl survey where they established 5 or 6 lines in the wind farm, and every week they would trawl the exact same spot. They would also do that in 2 control areas, south and east of the wind farm. And they completed that study this year, and they found that codfish and black sea bass were in greater abundance, and no doubt by the pictures I showed you. And all other species were kind of even-steven. If squid or some flounder were down in the wind farm or up, it was down or up a corresponding amount in the control areas. So it's really a proven fact that, there is greater fish abundance in wind farms, and that has played out with our experience and my personal experience at the Block Island Wind Farm. However, this issue of climate that the good doctor spoke about is something very concerning to recreational anglers. And again, Jen McCann is here from Sea Grant. She was kind enough to run a program in conjunction with the recreational fishing community and the scientific community this year that studied the effects of climate change on recreational fishing and boating. It was the Beard Symposium. It was a 3-symposia event. And it was a panel discussion of fishermen and charter captains talking about what the changes they're seeing on the water, and then climate scientists. In fact, John here was one of them. He's NOAA's chief scientist, commented, the reason why you're seeing this change in fish species or whatever is because of X, Y, and Z. So it was a very beneficial symposia. The key learnings were that climate change were exponential. Fishermen like myself are seeing very quick change on the water. Warm water fish are arriving, cold water fish are leaving our area. One unique thing is we have robust bait profiles. Mackerel, herring, silverside, squid, etc., all here in great abundance, all at the same time, which is highly unusual. And this has occurred for the last 5 years in particular. It's warm water attracting the bait. The bait is attracting huge animals. Giant bluefin tuna, 30 giant bluefin tuna were caught off Narragansett in Newport on one day, September 18th this year, which is unheard of. School tuna, people who have fished school tuna never before are catching them. Large animals, humpbacks. We heard about the New Jersey and the New York strandings in particular. Again, this robust bait profile is close to shore, and these animals are feeding on it, and there are enhanced ship strikes, Porpoise, right in our bay. Last week at Sabin Point in Providence, all the way up the Providence River, a pod of dolphins, unheard of before. Sharks in abundance, exotic warm water fish like mahi and cobia. And you can see some of these species. These anglers never ever caught a bluefin tuna before. They were able to go out and catch them. It's problematic because now these fish are getting hammered due to climate change. It's great that they're here, but they're getting hammered. Sharks close to shore. This shark was caught 1.5 miles, 2 miles off of Newport. These poor anglers have never caught a shark in their entire life before. You can see this guy was totally pleased. He caught a cobia. We're catching cobia, believe it or not, quite often in our area, which is something we hadn't, and an enhanced abundance of mahi, which hasn't been the case before. So where do we go from here? This is the wrap up. I've been getting the time signal for a couple of minutes now. Did I get time for the down of the machine? No, I'm only kidding. So we need to enhance climate research. We need robust stock assessments. We got to kickstart NOAA. Janet Coit from Rhode Island, God bless her, heads up NOAA Fisheries now. We need more climate research on stock assessments and climate research in general to figure out what's happening to all these fish. We need to engage each other on offshore wind with anglers having a seat at the table, which so far they have, providing input and advocating for research before, during, and after with monitoring plans. This is something that happened this year, which is outstanding. The National Academy of Sciences agreed to be the non-partial entity guiding our research in terms of wind farms and fishing. Where they're going to, it's not going to be the fishing industry, it's not going to be the wind farm industry, it's going to be the National Academy that's going to weigh in on what kind of research needs to be done. We need to communicate to anglers to make sure everyone understands they can fish wind farms like we fish Block Island, and we need to organize anglers coastwide. And thank you very much, I appreciate it.
Thank you, Captain David Monty. Next up, we have Dr. Shiloh Felton. She is the Senior Scientist at Renewable Energy Wildlife Institute.
Thank you to Amanda, and thanks to Priscilla for inviting me to speak to you all today, and a big thank you to Representative McGraw for hosting this event, and to all of you for being here. A little background on me and my organization. I'm a senior scientist, as Amanda said, with the Renewable Energy Wildlife Institute, or REWI for short. We were formed about 14 years ago by NGO and industry stakeholders to try to find a way to support a transition to renewable energy while conserving native wildlife. I came to this role after receiving a PhD from North Carolina State University as a climate science fellow working in coastal bird conservation management. Serving after that as for the state of Rhode Island as your state's threatened and endangered species biologist, and then as a science advisor for the National Audubon Society before coming to REWI. There are a few ways in which birds and bats might be adversely impacted by offshore wind energy. So I'm not going to come here and lie to you today that there's no negative interactions there, right? Individuals may be at risk of colliding with the turbines if they tend to fly at a height of the rotors and have shown less tendency to avoid turbine blades. And we know that some species are less good at doing that from studies in Europe at offshore wind facilities there. Some species may even have behaviors that make them more attracted to areas around turbines if they see wakes from the turbines and think that that's a fishing area, a good place for fish. Species that are more likely to avoid the developments altogether and are good at avoiding the turbines might be vulnerable to displacement effects. So if wind turbines and turbine projects are put in areas that are really important habitat, then that could create a loss of habitat for birds that are vulnerable to displacement effects. And then on top of that, we have migrating or commuting birds that may also have to use more energy if there's a barrier effect. So if they are rerouted around turbines in order to get to feeding areas or migrating around these turbines, they could expend more energy. And then an animal's flight behavior, the level of exposure to the facilities based on the species' natural distribution, and then overall population size for a species affected determine how much at risk or how vulnerable a species or population is to a wind farm. Species that are already endangered, for example, are higher concern if they're likely to be exposed to a potential project. I'm going to move this just a little bit, so I apologize for the noise. I feel like I'm to the side of the computer. It feels weird. I also want to address bats in offshore wind. Bats have been a concern for onshore wind projects or land-based wind projects. It's an active area of research. Hoary bats, eastern red bats, and silver-haired bats, which are all long-distance migratory species of bat, account for 70% of bat fatalities at onshore or land-based wind farms. And bat prevalence at a site is a poor predictor of collision risk during operation, which means that if we do a study ahead of deploying wind and we don't see any bats, it actually doesn't mean anything about whether or not some bats might be vulnerable to the wind. So it's led to hypotheses that bats may actually be attracted to turbines. But we know when they're at highest risk. So we have some very specific parameters. They're most at risk at nighttime, during fall migration, and when wind speeds are low during those specific times of year and day. So typically under 10 meters per second. And we know that some of these species of long-distance migrating bats have been seen offshore. A study by Solik and Newman summarized records of bats sighted offshore, which are the yellow dots on this map for anybody who can actually see it. They're the ones that are further away from the coastline generally. And then there are also those that are detected through acoustic stations, and those are in red, and most of the acoustic stations are much closer to shore or were on boats that were also close to shore. Hoary bats were present at 88% of the acoustic stations, but there weren't any records existing over the open ocean for that species. And eastern red bat and silver-haired bat accounted for most of the open ocean sightings, though also tricolored bat and big brown bat were detected up to 12 to 14 kilometers away from shore. There's also a recent record of a silver-haired bat landing on a charter fishing boat approximately 22 nautical miles southeast of Nantucket. And that was just in 2021, so watch out for those on the charter vessels. That'll be interesting. But there is research underway in Rhode Island by folks at URI and others to help us better understand how bats are moving around wind turbines. Using the Block Island Wind Farm, they put up a telemetry receiver so we can tag small birds and bats and put little tags on them, and then the telemetry receiver on Block Island Wind Farm, and hopefully in the future other turbine platforms will help pick up on those little backpacks. And we can get an idea of how those are moving. Right now, folks at URI and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service are testing how good these stations on turbine platforms are at actually picking up this movement. And so they dragged a kite with a tag on it behind a boat and tested it on the Block Island Wind Farm and 2 other telemetry receivers on Block Island. And it actually did a pretty good job, especially if there were multiple receiver stations picking up on that tag. So hopefully this information is going to be used, and actually they are creating guidance from this information for wind farm operators to be able to deploy telemetry receiver stations in a scientifically sound way at their farms. URI has also been involved in a study that was part of the OSAMP, the Rhode Island OSAMP research, to understand how birds are mostly distributed offshore Rhode Island. And they did a combination of vessel and aerial transects. This is an example of the transect surveys for the winter for northern gannet. So the bigger the red dot on this, the more gannets were in the flock when they sighted them on this on the surveys in winter. And then the plot on the right is showing what the model distribution is based on those sightings. And putting all of the information like that together for all of the different species, they actually were able to do this really cool conservation priority planning that showed how good actually the areas off of Rhode Island are that we're planning to build offshore wind for birds. So this is a little technical and I apologize for it, and since it's a little small, it's not going to be super helpful, but On the top left is a picture of the distribution of model distribution for all bird groups. And they've taken out a small little white square that's just southwest of Block Island. And when they take out that tiny little white square, theoretically speaking, if they were to develop a wind farm there, we see in the plot to the right of that an immediate drop in the available, in the proportion of distribution remaining for, I believe it's loons that went down first. Oh no, it's scoters, I'm so sorry. So this yellow line, I'm just gonna point it out quickly. Right here, it goes down really fast. So if you take out this section that's really important for scoter and some other seabirds, then you immediately see a drop in the available and the distribution remaining for these birds. Comparing that to where South Fork and Revolution and Sunrise Wind are going. Revolution is the wind project that's intended to bring power to Rhode Island and Connecticut. You take that out and you don't see that drop immediately. So the only species that are really impacted more immediately are storm petrels. And they're going to be affected no matter where you put offshore wind because they're evenly distributed throughout the landscape. They're also less sensitive to disturbance from the wind farm, so they're less likely to lose habitat. Yeah, definitely write your question down and then they'll pick it up. If anybody has cards that they are holding on to, feel free to raise them and people can come around and pick them up from you.
Just ask a question.
I only have so much time, so I'm just trying to get through it. I'm very long-winded. So another study off the coast of Cape Cod showed the importance of Nantucket shoals on sea ducks. And so I just want to point out that this other study off the coast of Cape Cod was showing that there's this area on Nantucket shoals where sea ducks are actually following amphipod populations and really rely heavily on that area. So I just want to take a quick break from talking about bird biology to show you briefly the BOEM wind process for how they decide on where to put these farms. I'm going to skip over this process slide because I think Amber is going to get into it and I'm already over time. But through this process of comment periods and environmental assessments, a large chunk of what was originally planned to be offered as leases or was originally being investigated was cut off. So especially in this Massachusetts area, you can see the original area is much, much larger. And this entire section to the right was removed to make what we now know as the lease areas. And comparing that to the areas that are important for sea ducks, you see the area that was removed in large part was removed because of its importance for sea ducks and their foraging. So none of the areas that are expected to bring power to Rhode Island overlap with this important sea duck area. I'd be remiss if I didn't point out how vulnerable sea ducks and many other marine birds are to climate change. The white-winged scoter is one of 389 species that Bateman et al. Modeled, showing significant range losses for the species should global temperatures be allowed to rise to 3 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Bats as well are vulnerable to climate change, but they're also vulnerable to loss of suitable habitat and insect abundance, both of which can be accentuated by climate change. It's important to think of these challenges on a global scale and consider losses due to climate change of not having offshore wind. Citing these projects, as we have done in Rhode Island, in areas of lower risk for birds is the first step in responsibly developing this technology. For impacts that cannot be avoided, we can continue to support the development and testing of technologies available to minimize adverse interactions, including detection, deterrent, and curtailment technologies, which have been successfully used at land-based wind to make them a viable option for offshore wind as well. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Shiloh. Next up, we have Dr. Bob Kenny from the University of Rhode Island Graduate School of Oceanography.
I always have to push this lower. Hi, I'm Bob Kenny. I'm from URI Graduate School of Oceanography. I'm about 3/4 retired from a research job there, and I've been there for 45 years. I was asked to talk about right whales, which means I'm not going to talk about wind turbines, and I'm not going to talk about the other 35 or 36 species of marine mammals that occur in our waters. I'm going to focus on just one species. If you can see it, this is a right whale. It's they're big and black and rotund. They have no dorsal fin, and they have this strange sort of upside down grin for their mouth. And you'll see better in another picture that they have these white crusty patches on their heads. Adults are between 35 and 55 feet long. Babies are about 15 feet long, and they grow really fast. When they're weaned at about a year old, they're twice the size, so they're about 30 feet when they're a year old. We can identify every individual that we see. So if we can take a picture of a whale, we can tell you who that whale is. Oftentimes we can give you entire family histories of them. And we do it by these crusty patches on their heads, which are part whale and part these things that look like little crabs that live on their skin. So all the white on the head here are these other animals that live on the whale. And they outline these warty patches of whale skin, and we can identify the whales. We can also take a skin sample with the biopsy dart and do a DNA profile, and you can identify an animal by the DNA. So this is sort of a summary of the photo ID catalog. So it's the North Atlantic Right Whale Consortium's catalog. It's maintained by New England Aquarium. You can actually go online and look at pictures and look at the histories of all these whales yourselves. As of last August, there were about 90,000 sightings in the catalog. There were over 2 million photos included, plus the DNA samples. And this number doesn't go to last August, this is last week. Last week the catalog had 782 different whales in it. And this goes back to whales that haven't been seen since the 60s. So some of these are dead. They're not all live whales, but there are 782 in the catalog. As of the last time that I actually went through and counted it up, there were 368 males, 323 females, and 75 where we didn't know the sex. This is concerning because the sex ratio at birth is 50-50. That means that females have a higher mortality rate than males, because once they get older than a few years, males outnumber females. Out of those 323 females, 184 of them have given birth to at least one calf, and some of them it's up to 8 or more. They are skim feeders. They feed by swimming through the water with their mouth wide open. Water flows in the front and out through the baleen plates at the side and filters their food out. And that's why they have these really bizarre skulls. The inside of a right whale, you wouldn't believe what it looks like. And unlike everyone else at this table, I brought show and tell. So I have a sample of right whale baleen up here on the stage, so you can come up and fondle baleen if you've never had a chance to do that before. Here's a couple illustrations of what right whale feeding looks like. You can, in the live whale here, you can see the individual plates from the side. So the water's flowing through and out through the plates and filtering their food. This is what they eat. They eat crustaceans called copepods. They're not really that big. If they were that big, there'd be a chain of restaurants up and down the East Coast called the Red Copepod. They're actually about the size of small grain rice. That means that a right whale is about 50 billion times bigger than what it eats. That is like you swimming around in the water with your mouth open trying to filter bacteria from the water. Not very appetizing for one thing, but if you couldn't do that by trying to eat them one at a time, you'd have to find places where those bacteria were concentrated together, like in a big spoonful of yogurt. And the right whales do the same thing. They hunt out places in the ocean where the copepods are crammed into dense layers, and they filter those. And if we can find those spots, we can collect samples like this one in the lower left-hand corner. That was a spot where we dragged a net near some feeding right whales and collected the densest sample we'd ever seen. And that is about 98% one species. It's Calanus finmarchicus, their preferred species. And it's even more complicated than that, because the right whales don't just prefer that one species, they prefer one age class of that species. Because they have hard shells on the outside, they grow by molting their shell and going through stages. And the last juvenile stage has this big drop of oil in it that they use to make eggs when they molt to the adult stage. So that 5th stage juvenile, that's the primo right whale food. The other take-home lesson here is that the places where right whales really like to eat are not places where there's a highly productive food chain going on. It's not nutrients and phytoplankton and zooplankton. What causes those patches is the physics, not the biology. It's how the water aggregates those prey patches together. This is what the range of the species used to look like before whaling. This is more what it looks like now. They're pretty much gone from the eastern side of the North Atlantic. And the few whales, if we get a whale over there and we get a good picture of it, we can almost always say, oh yeah, that's one of ours. So it's probably an extinct population on the eastern side and just what's left on the American side. This is a close-up more of the feeding range, and this annual cycle goes, they give birth to their calves off of Georgia and Florida in the winter, and that's off the scale of this map. I can try this, see if it works. The first feeding ground is here in Cape Cod Bay, and that's in the late winter, early spring. And then they move out east of Cape Cod into the Great South Channel, and that's the late spring feeding ground. And then they filter their way on up to Canada. And the summer feeding grounds are in the Bay of Fundy and on the Nova Scotian Shelf. 2010 is the critical year. In 2010, everything started to change. And since 2010, Cape Cod Bay, the number of whales in there is even more. Out in the Great South Channel, there are fewer. In the Bay of Fundy, some years there aren't any. So there's very rare around here, but instead they're going up here to the Gulf of St. Lawrence. About 140 whales summer in the Gulf of St. Lawrence now. And then they started coming down here to southern New England, to Nantucket Shoals, and off of Rhode Island, south of the Cape and Islands. In fact, I just got a report on Saturday that New England Aquarium's aerial survey saw 33 right whales and 7 humpbacks on the southern tip of Nantucket Shoals just last Friday. This is what the population's abundance looks like going back to 1990. So this is from 1990. The population was actually growing quite nicely up until about 2010. Remember, I said that was the year when things changed. And then the population started declining. And this is the last abundance estimate was 340 for 2021. This is based on a really sophisticated population model, and you can see the little blue bars around it. The precision of those abundance estimates is really fine. It's 340 plus or minus 7. So the question is, why are they declining? And a lot of the answer is not difficult. Right whales occur in some of the busiest oceans of the world. They have to share their ocean with big ships. Sometimes they survive a collision. This guy's got some propeller slashes that healed up. Sometimes they don't do so well. And this one was split down the middle like a butcher and a chicken. We do a stock assessment every year. The government does a stock assessment. The latest draft version does a 5-year average mortality and serious injury. That's what M&SI is. And there's 2 numbers. There's 2.5 is the average per year, and those are just the dead bodies on beaches. On average, 2.5 whales we find per year that are killed by ships. But we can also back calculate from that abundance model the difference between the number one year and the number the next year is how many new ones were added minus how many died, and we can estimate that almost 10 are being killed by ships every year. And here's a couple examples. This is Staccato. She was the biggest whale we ever measured. This was April 1999. She was at least 25 years old, had given birth to 6 calves, and she looked fine, but her bones were all crushed up inside. And if you've ever been in Audubon's aquarium in Bristol, they have a baleen plate from Staccato, and they're way bigger than the ones that I brought. This is a whale named Infinity. She was born in 2002, and when she was 19 years old, she gave birth to her first calf. On February 12th, a 54-foot sport fishing boat going 24 knots going into Florida ran over both of them. The calf was slashed up. This is the next day on the beach. Infinity was seen 3 days after that, and she was all cut up, and she hasn't been seen since, so she's probably dead too. This is a really strange case. This was a calf that was born in 1991 and hit by a ship when she was just a baby. But she survived with these really deep scars, so they named her Lucky. In 2005, she got pregnant, and the pressure of the pregnancy, she basically exploded. All those scars opened up, and she died from that. The other thing that kills whales is fishing gear, and it's the fishing gear that just sits and catches lobsters or catches fish. Out of every 5 right whales, 4 have been entangled at least once. Lots of them have been entangled multiple times. 1 has been entangled 8 times. And we can tell that by the scars from where they pick up the gear on their tails. The average 5-year average mortality is 5.7 from the dead bodies and 17.6 from the model estimates. I'll skip through, I should tell you about this one because this was a Rhode Island whale. This was catalog number 2366 when he was a calf. This is the following year, had a rope coming out of his mouth. The year after that, he washed up on Second Beach right here in Rhode Island, and with all the skin peeled off and the rope still wrapped around its flipper. And this is what the bone looked like when it was cleaned out. So the whale kept growing. Remember I said calves grow pretty fast. The whale kept growing, but the rope, it's plastic rope. It's polypropylene. It doesn't stretch, it doesn't decompose, and the whale just ended up with this strangulating injury that killed it. We'll skip through the ugly one. So here's the other part of the story. Also, 2010 is when the calving rate started to go right down in the dumper. To 2018, which was the first year that we ever saw where we had 0 calves born. And remember I told you those 2 estimated mortality numbers? If we add them up, the average mortality and serious injury from human causes, not from anything else, from entanglement and ship strikes, is 27 a year. And there are only ever been 3 years when more than 27 calves were born. If more whales die every year than are being born, the population is going to continue to go down. What about climate change? Okay, it's probably not going to look like this. But we know there are climate effects on the population. The reason that the calving rate is declining is because females aren't getting enough food. A healthy female right whale has a calf every 3 years. She's pregnant for a year, she nurses the calf for a year, and then she takes a year to restore her blubber until she can get pregnant again. If feeding is slow, that resting year turns into 2 or 3 or 4, and in some cases 10 years between calves. And that lowers the rate overall. And that's because the water's getting warmer, their food supply is really a cold water species, and they've had to hunt around to find new places to eat. The other thing is that the changing distribution patterns means that the whales are wandering around more. They're going places where they didn't used to go. We have all of these management schemes in place to protect the whales, and then they go someplace else. So the UME, the unusual mortality event that everyone reads about online for right whales, started in 2017 when all these whales went up to the Gulf of St. Lawrence and got messed up with the snow crab fishery that's up there, and 17 whales died that summer. The Canadians responded a lot quicker than our system is even set up to do. So that was the last time they had that big mortality. Thank you for listening.
Thank you to Dr. Bob Kenny. Next up, we have Amber Hewitt, who is the Offshore Wind Energy Program Director at National Wildlife Federation.
Thank you. Thanks to Representative McGraw and to Priscilla and Amanda for organizing this event and for the invitation to be a part of it. And thanks to all of you for choosing to spend your evening here hearing from all of us. So I'm going to wrap us up and I'll try to keep it quick so that we can maximize time for your questions. But my goal with the next 10 minutes is to hopefully bring some comfort to anyone who's here with concerns around the potential impacts of offshore wind development on wildlife. My name is Amber Hewitt. I'm the Offshore Wind Energy Program Director with the National Wildlife Federation. And I've been working on offshore wind at National Wildlife Federation for just over 10 years. So this intersection of how we can advance this important climate solution while protecting wildlife every step of the way is really where I've spent most of my brain power for the past 10 years. I joined National Wildlife Federation just as our offshore wind program was getting started. And we started it because we had recently, at that point, taken on the position and recognition that climate change is a leading threat to wildlife and habitat, and that we need to be able to support large-scale clean energy solutions. And of course, those solutions will look different from region to region. But at that time, when we were looking at where to really, in the Northeast region in particular, what solutions we could feel really comfortable as a wildlife and conservation organization digging into and finding ways to support, offshore wind really jumped off the page here in the Northeast as untapped potential at that time. That said, while it was a really abundant opportunity, it also has the potential to have really significant impacts on wildlife. So we found this to be a really important place for us to build program and advocacy efforts. So in the time that has passed since then, this past decade, our definition of responsible development, our standard that we set to be able to support offshore wind power, the list has only grown. So that's what you have on your screen now, just to give you a sense of where we set our standards to be able to support an offshore wind project. Our definition of responsible means that projects avoid, minimize, mitigate, and monitor impacts on wildlife and habitat. They reduce negative impacts on other ocean uses. They include robust consultation with Native American tribes and communities. They meaningfully engage state and local governments and stakeholders. They include comprehensive efforts to avoid impacts to underserved communities, and they use the best available scientific and technological data to ensure that science-based and stakeholder-informed decision-making informs a project every step of the way. So that's and we honestly add to this definition every year or so. So our list as to what a project needs to do to meet our standards is a living principle, and it is shaped in each region by the stakeholders and the people who care about that place and the wildlife and the habitat that inhabit it. If a project doesn't meet our standard, we quite simply will not support it, and we have history of litigating against an offshore wind project in New Jersey that did not meet our standard. As the person who leads our offshore wind program, I hope we never have to do that again. And so that's the work that I try to lead our organization in, is steering and influencing those who are making decisions about offshore wind, be it elected officials, regulators, project developers, and to bring experts and our knowledge on how to protect wildlife and how to protect communities to the table so that we can ultimately come out of the other side with better projects, and only projects that really serve the people and wildlife that will be affected by them. So I think it's important to note, because I know, because of how often in my personal life I talk about offshore wind, that this is not common knowledge, but the United States only hosts 7 offshore wind turbines. So for all of the talk, all of the headlines, all of the policy and leasing and permitting, this image on your screen is the entire United States offshore wind fleet, and 5 of them, of course, are home right here in Rhode Island, and the other 2 are in federal waters off of Virginia. So we are at the very beginning. We're a long way down the road, but we are still just getting started. We are at the cusp of making this happen, and so if you're here with concern or skepticism or questions, you're in the right place, because there's still time to shape and influence what this industry looks like, and it's really important that you engage in the process to make sure that your voices are heard. We have been trying to get offshore wind on the radar of decision makers for a long time at National Wildlife Federation, and we've come a long way. Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, of course, these states have really understood the value of offshore wind for a long time, but it's only recently, in the past couple of years, that ambition has really been matched all along the Atlantic coast, and is spreading to the Gulf Coast and the West Coast. And the Biden administration, in March of 2021, for the first time ever, set a national goal, a megawatt-specific and time-bound goal as to what this nation would do on offshore wind, to advance offshore wind over the course of the decade that we're in right now. So the Biden administration committed to deploying 30 gigawatts of offshore wind power by 2030. So that's 30,000 megawatts. By comparison, the image I showed you of the 7 turbines is a grand total of 42 megawatts. So our entire capacity as a nation right now is 42 megawatts, and by the end of this decade, we're supposed to get to 30,000 megawatts. It's a pretty ambitious goal. They then re-upped that goal in September of last year and said that there would be another 15,000 megawatts of offshore wind developed in deep water, requiring floating turbines. So that's places like the Gulf of Maine, the West Coast, where water gets really deep really fast. We're going to need this new, more nascent technology. So we now have a goal to reach this incredibly ambitious scale of development in a fairly short time. But it's also important to note that that ambition at the federal level really just reflects what states are already committed to doing. States like Rhode Island and Massachusetts and Connecticut and New York and Virginia, this is really a matching between federal and state commitments. What the Biden administration also gave us is a sense of where that large-scale build-out will happen. So for the first time, we got a map with the circles that you see, if you can, the circled dots surrounding the country are the places that the Biden administration is committed to advancing offshore wind development. And along the bottom is a timeline as to when these new lease areas would be made available. And this is in addition to the lease areas that that were leased to developers under the Obama and Trump administrations. So this is a continuation of an existing program, but a real exponential scaling up of it. And that kind of scaling up, as personally an offshore wind enthusiast, as someone who needs to consider wildlife and community engagement in my work every day, that scaling up even makes me nervous, because we have a lot to get right really fast in a lot of places. And so that presents some really significant challenges. On wildlife protection, as we heard from the speakers before me, there's a lot of potentially impacted species, a lot of data that needs to be collected, ideally consistent data over long periods of time, things that really can't be rushed. There's a need for the workforce and supply chain in the United States to be ready to build and source this scaling up of material. That's something that can't happen overnight, right? It's something that we should have gotten started on a couple of decades ago. And so to make sure that these turbines are manufactured in the United States requires a real commitment to invest in domestic manufacturing and training the workforce that will build these turbines. And finally, an image that looks very much like the room we're in right now, community engagement, right? Building trust and comfort in the communities that will be most affected by offshore wind development, and making sure that their voices are heard and that they're shaping these projects, right? Like the Block Island Wind Farm gave us an example of how that could play out. There's so much community engagement around that project, but to do that in so many places on hopefully shortening timelines, because as we heard from Timmins, we don't have a ton of time on the climate crisis, and so we have to be able to make sure that we're building the future projects a little faster than the Block Island Wind Farm and the 2 turbines off of Virginia came to be. I could talk to you all night about the potential threats to wildlife, and so I will just sort of sort them into these 3 areas of concern. Underwater noise, vessel strikes, and collision risk, as we've heard a bit about tonight, are really the sort of primary areas of focus that we believe there's, alongside potential impact, real potential to solve these challenges with technology and with policy. The approach that we take is really, it's exhaustive, it is comprehensive. We consider the potential impacts to wildlife at every stage of project development, from siting to construction to operations and maintenance, and all the way through to what decommissioning will look like. We rank the order in which protection can and should be applied by most effective. So we are always first seeking to avoid impacts, then to minimize them, then to compensate for impacts that may not be able to be avoided. And this is something that I assure you gets great scrutiny at all hours of every day. The National Wildlife Federation convenes at the state and federal levels hundreds of partners and experts to examine every single project that is proposed, the thousands of pages of proposal documents, and when a lease area is being designated at every step of the process, we examine the potential risks that come with that area and try to make sure that lines are drawn in a way that avoid as much impact as is possible. We do this in 3 places. We bring our advocacy to the federal level, to the state level, and directly to developers. And so just to run through what that looks like very quickly, this rainbow graph that Shiloh gave us a teaser of earlier is the federal leasing and permitting process in a timeline. So you probably can't see, but each colored block is a different step in the leasing and permitting process. So for any offshore wind project in federal waters, it needs to run through this entire timeline. The sort of yellow, this stretch here, the green to yellow bar represents about a 5-year process of environmental assessment. And as you can see, there are several years leading up to that of just identifying the right areas, and then in follow-up, the ability to comment on specific project proposals. At each colored section of that timeline, there is a public comment opportunity, and without exception, National Wildlife Federation and many of our partners provide detailed comments, which are all publicly available. So if you have concerns or questions about any specific project or lease area, I'd be happy to provide you with our detailed recommendations and which of them are being taken, right? Because you can provide recommendations, but then hopefully they materialize into a difference in what the project looks like. So that's a large part of our advocacy at the federal level is in this formal commenting process and then in direct engagement to federal regulators. At the state level, there is really incredible opportunity for states as the buyers of this energy. This is where I spend most of my time and where I certainly have the most passion, but there is a lot of opportunity for states as the buyers of this energy to set their own parameters, be it in policy and law or in solicitation of offshore wind power, to set higher standards above what the federal government is requiring, to say this is what it will look like if you want to sell offshore wind power to Rhode Island. For example, and Rhode Island has done this in a law passed just last year. Rhode Island set some really high standards for what offshore wind project proposals need to look like. And we have some great stories of success in your neighboring states as well, be it, the sky's the limit and what you can ask for, right? And so when you have the attention of your state decision makers, make sure that you ask them, what are you doing to make sure that offshore wind is being developed in a way that protects wildlife? In New York and New Jersey, developers are required to contribute $10,000 per megawatt of their project to invest in research and monitoring of wildlife. That's just because advocates asked for it. They didn't need to do that, right? So there's a lot that can happen at the state level with the access that you have to your state decision makers. And finally, when all else fails, when we can't get what we're asking for at the federal or state levels in policy, we go straight to developers and negotiate with them specific to their project the pieces that we asked for that fell to the cutting room floor, we call them into negotiation to hopefully get them to voluntarily agree to go above and beyond what's required of them, which is actually something that we've had some great success in as well. So for example, the South Fork Wind Farm, one of the only 2 fully federally permitted projects that should begin construction this year, the developer agreed to reduce their vessel speeds to 10 knots or lower for all vessels at all times related to that project. They didn't need to do that, but understood that it was a way to decrease the risk to marine mammals of vessel strikes, as we just heard about being a leading cause of death to marine mammals. So I hope that this was a helpful snapshot, but there is so much more where that came from. So I hope that you will stay in touch. My contact information is on the screen, and I really appreciate your time this evening.
Lots of questions, which is great. We have all these questions from you. That's why we're here tonight. So, hi everyone. Good evening. I was introduced earlier by Rep. McGraw. I am Priscilla De La Cruz. I am the Senior Policy Director at the Audubon Society of Rhode Island, or the Government Affairs Director, depends which title I want to go with on a given day. But I wear a number of other hats as the President of the Environment Council of Rhode Island and also the Co-Chair of Climate Jobs Rhode Island. So it's a true pleasure to be here with you tonight. So a couple of things in terms of the Q&A format of our Rockstar lineup of panelists. So as you all know, we were planning for an event of about 70, 80 people or so at a different venue down the street. Of course, we are thrilled that you are all here tonight, but that means that this event is like 3-4 times bigger than we anticipated. So of course, recognizing that we're not going to be able to go question by question, what we've done with the note cards is that we've grouped the duplicate questions, and I think we can all expect that there's a high probability of questions that are going to be very similar in the room. So we've grouped those questions by themes and similar questions. So we will get to as many questions as possible using this note card format. So that is really the goal behind us collecting the note cards. We want to be able to get to as much as possible while we have you in the room. But a couple other quick things talking to Rep. McGraw. She will remind us at the end of the event what are the resources that you will have available leaving this discussion. So she did mention the recording, also the PowerPoint slides, but the fact that we have your questions written is really great, because now we can turn them into FAQs. So we're going to go ahead and group them also by topic and post that on Rep. McGraw's website and also on other resources throughout the web, like for example, Audubon's webpage or the Environment Council's webpage or Climate Jobs. And also just to point out, there are a lot of specific questions to developers by project. For example, Ørsted was mentioned a couple times. Ørsted is not here, and to be frank, that was by intention. We want to get through the academic side of things and the research and the science and the facts. So there could be other forums, right, in the future where developers might be in the room, but we also think that if a question is about a project specifically tied to a developer, that developer should answer that question for you all. So Rep. McGraw has committed to also group those questions, and we'll get those direct answers and also post them on the website. So just wanted to go ahead and share that. So to kick things off, we're going to go ahead and start talking about the impact of the turbines and the environment. So of course, any of our panelists can go ahead and speak to these types of questions. But I do want to point out, I love that Captain Monty talked about what is currently in our backyards in Rhode Island, which is the Block Island Offshore Wind Farm. So, that was not me. So considering that the Block Island Wind Farm is a small project, right? It was the first one in the nation. It is a big deal. It happened in our backyard, but it's 5 turbines. So some of you have referred to some of these projects that we're talking about 100 turbines, right? So that increases some of the impacts that you've referenced. So starting off with you, Captain Monley, can you speak to that, and can others also weigh in terms of, again, reiterating some of the key things you want us to walk away when it comes to how these projects could impact the environment and mammals and so on?
Is there an on switch? I guess it's on.
It's on.
I'm not a scientist. I'm more of a fisherman, but I do know that in Europe, and I think I referenced one study that was done where, and everyone knows in Europe, Denmark produces so much electricity, they export it to other European countries. So there are wind farms with hundreds and hundreds of turbines in Europe. And in those wind farms, fish abundance was greater in wind farm areas than outside. One other thing that the Nature's Conservancy did recently is they came out with a study where they were actually enhancing structure at the base of turbines to attract more fish, make it more of an artificial reef. And they claimed in that research study that they did that the enhanced structure would actually blend and enhance the environment and create positive impacts rather than negative. So the whole point of what negative impacts are going to occur, here we see positive impacts being occurred in Europe and at Block Island. And the hope is that at least recreational anglers hope that that'll be the case with multiple wind farms too. But again, I'm not a scientist, I'm a fisherman. So I'll defer to others if anyone cares to.
That's a really tough question to answer. The range of potential effects includes a lot of different things, and some of them, no matter how many turbines there are, it's not going to increase. If you worry about the operational noise, the noise from the Block Island turbines can't be heard above background noise within 50 meters. The turbines in the bigger farms are going to be a mile or 1.1 miles apart, so the noise isn't going to add up. It makes no difference how many there are. It's still not going to be heard beyond 50 meters of each individual turbine. The newer turbines are going to be bigger, so that zone's going to be a little bit more. But basically, operational noise isn't going to be a problem. The thing that we worry about the most is the pile driving. Pile driving is a very loud sound. It's going to disturb a lot of marine mammals, and that's the thing that they have to work on to mitigate the most.
Cool. So I just want to, I completely agree with what's been said. So all I will add is that I don't want to, there's no reason to give the impression that we're not aware that there will be impact and that scaling up will have greater impact. I really want to underscore that we are doing this because we have to, and because saying no to offshore wind is saying yes to something else, and it will almost always be something with greater impact. In the New England region, we have these choices between building offshore wind and building more gas pipelines, between relying on offshore wind during a winter cold snap or firing up oil reserves. And so those are the pressures that we have to find a way to be able to make this resource as responsible as possible, because at the outset, it is a better path forward than so many of our terrible choices and the choices that got us into the place that we are today. And so as I went through my presentation, we take the impacts really seriously, and we will do everything we can to minimize those impacts and influence these projects to be responsible. And we just have this really difficult decision to make right now as to how we will keep our lights on, how we will continue to power the lives that we all live, and it's a choice that we have to make.
Great, so another topic that we got a lot of questions on is money related and influence related. This question is, we learned at the last meeting in Portsmouth on wind energy that Shell Oil, the company backing South Coast Wind, has distributed over $100 million to various environmental groups, institutions, and scientists. Although we would never accuse anyone of purposely lying, we know that funding can bias science. Can you please tell us how much funding the New England for Offshore Wind Coalition has received from wind projects and their parent companies?
I'll take this one. So the National Wildlife Federation has a very firm policy around not taking a single penny from offshore wind developers. So we don't, it is a firm and solid line. We don't take a dollar from anyone invested in the offshore wind industry. And that is also true of the New England for Offshore Wind Coalition. That was actually a barrier to entry for us, that it had to be entirely advocacy and philanthropy driven so that our motives couldn't be questioned, because we really stand on solid ground that this needs to happen for wildlife and for communities and for workers. And so it's a really clear-cut answer.
Thank you for that. And I can also, I can just speak for the Audubon Society of Rhode Island because that's who I work for. And also the Environment Council of Rhode Island as well. I've been affiliated with them for well over a decade in my professional career. And no, we do not have funding coming directly from any developer. And I also will say, for the sake of transparency, we do have everything that has to do with how we get our revenues is posted on the Audubon website. So our audited financials are up there. And if you have a hard time finding them, please come speak to me. And also I want to point out, I've heard from some members of Audubon that they're in the room and that they're glad we are having this event. So we are very much a member-based organization and donor-driven by individuals like you in this room. So the next question I want to go ahead and direct has to do with visibility. There were a lot of questions, of course, about the impact to the Seconic River and the placement of the turbines depending on the project and whether they have to be so close to the shore or whether they could be farther. And also if they're just going to impact daily quality life in terms of recreation, right? And how you enjoy Seconic River. So is there anyone that could speak to that, even if it's from experience for Block Island Wind Farm, but also thinking about what this growing industry mean for this community?
I am just familiar with studies that the University of Rhode Island did through Jen McCann's group, Sea Grant, where they did some social science work as to how the view of the wind farms were impacting tourism as well as real estate values, that sort of thing. And as I recall, there were no negative impacts. In fact, it actually created ecotourism for Block Island, where people were actually taken out. And I don't think real estate values on Block Island decreased at all. But I don't know. Again, I don't know if anyone else has any experience with that.
And then also pointing out to that question, there were a lot of things that were, again, specific by project in terms of the Seconic River and Revolution Wind. So we will get those specifics answered for you. Again, Orsted is not in the room, so we cannot answer the questions for you about why the blades are a certain size or why they are at the proximity to the shore that they will be. And Dr. Felton, just looking at you, you have the mic. Did you want to go ahead and add to that?
Well, I was just going to add that for project-specific information, there is, the developers release construction and operations plans. They are required to, and they are publicly available on BOEM's website. So if you have project-specific questions or questions about, they do viewshed modeling in those environmental impact statements. So you can always look up those documents and see on a clear day, on a not so clear day, what is your view from the coast going to look like in terms of how, really tiny those turbines are going to look, or big compared to, depending on what your perspective is.
Excuse me, I would just like to say that this is your idea of community involvement, where people come to actually ask and engage with you, and you make it so that you have the mic at all times. So I understand. I'm leaving. But this is what it's about. It's about this is no community involvement.
This is an educational program. The intent of the program was to provide education to the community, and I really appreciate our panel being here to provide some education to the community and to answer some of the questions. There may be future forums that allow for more community participation and an ability for people to express their views.
You're afraid of our views. You're afraid of hearing us speak to you directly.
I'm going to ask you to be respectful, and I'm going to return this back so we can get through a few more questions. Thank you.
Thank you. So this next question is concerning environmental justice. It states that low-income minority communities in America are often faced with hazardous chemicals and fumes from natural gas plants in their neighborhoods. Should offshore wind be compared with those situations?
So I'm going to take that question. I've been working on environmental justice. I lived in Louisiana for 10 years when I taught at Tulane University. And there, people are living literally across their fence is an oil refinery. For example, at Shell Norco, the whole town is named for the refining company. And there's minority and low-income communities living 50 feet from flaring natural gas, from highly explosive and highly toxic chemicals. In West Virginia, for example, mountaintop removal and other mining impacts are real for these people. And then we can't forget really the Marcellus Shale, where our fracked natural gas comes from. The gas that we're burning to keep our homes warm did not appear magically. It's not clean. It has contaminated groundwater. It's leaking methane all along the chain from production, from extraction to transportation to its combustion. And then there's all these disposal sites for all the impacts of fossil fuel industry. And I think really we do have to look at ourselves and say, what are we asking other people to bear that we are unwilling to bear? For me, I will speak for myself. I think really, turbines that are 12 miles away is quite a different situation than poor people who are unable to move away from an oil refinery or a fracked natural gas well, literally across the street or across a fence. So I think there's really an important point there. Thank you.
Well, what about other options like hydrogen and offshore wind?
So there were a lot of questions about the alternatives and whether offshore wind is the cleanest, best alternative that we have. And there were also a number of questions in terms of what about fossil fuels? What standards are applied to fossil fuel industry, and how does that compare to the offshore wind industry? So could some of you just speak to that in terms of when you're looking at fossil fuels, you're looking at offshore wind and other potential alternatives and technologies that are being tested and under development?
My question was about other renewables like onshore wind, solar, hydrogen.
We're going to get to that. Thank you very much. Go ahead.
It sounds like we're both going to jump to the clean alternatives, but on the fossil side, I mean, the standards that the industry is held to, I mean, I actually often get accused of, like, at National Wildlife Federation, that we are trying to apply higher standards of wildlife protection to the offshore wind industry than the fossil fuel industry has been held to, and that's true, we are, because it's something that we hope to support, and we didn't support any of that, right? That's not the model that we want to replicate, so we are looking to do something that is so much better than what we've done before, and that does come with learning from the mistakes of our past and setting higher standards for protection going forward. Even if it's clean, it will still have impact, and so it's really important that we set standards, and we're perfectly okay with them being higher than the far too loose standards that have been set before. On the topic of just what about the other clean energy sources, it's a great question, and the answer is that we need all of them. The answer is that we're not choosing between or pitting one renewable resource against another. Offshore wind power is tried and true. It's a 31-year-old industry. There are thousands of offshore wind turbines around the world. We are just behind. And so this is something that is untapped potential that it's an opportunity we're missing out on. particularly in New England, here in the region, we don't have any other utility scale clean energy solution that is commercially available to us. So a large scale offshore wind project, the Revolution Wind project, Sunrise Wind, the projects that are slated to be developed in this region, each one of them is the size of an average coal plant. We don't have solar and land-based wind resources in New England at quite that scale. We don't have a lot of land here. Our wind resource, if you were to compare a land-based wind speed and consistency map to an offshore wind speed and consistency map, the wind is a lot stronger and a lot more consistent offshore, similar to the land-based wind in the middle of the country. So the wind speeds off of the east coast of the United States really parallel those in the plains, where land-based wind is a really important solution. So there's still room and necessity for land-based wind and solar development here. We support those responsibly sited projects as well, and clean energy opportunities of the future, but we really need an all-of-them approach.
And I would just add, I think those are excellent points, in that this is a technology that we have now that is economic, and it's close to population centers. That is, these are right off of our coast. And then also, it's very difficult to site onshore wind if these turbines aren't 12 miles away from people's homes.
Yeah, and I would also say that these conversations are happening around land-based wind and solar as well. So there are studies that are modeling where wind and solar can be placed among a lot of community opposition, and where it can be placed when there isn't a lot of community opposition. And actually, when you have, in those modeling exercises, the more you have folks resisting renewable energy projects in ideal areas where there's a lot of planning for where to put them, the more you end up pushing those renewable energy projects into less desirable places for the environment, for environmental justice communities. And so there's a study, just to add to Amber's point that really we need all of these technologies because there isn't enough space offshore to put everything we need for our energy needs. There's a great study that has come out from Princeton University called Net Zero America, and that models how much renewable energy we need under different scenarios. And that includes how much carbon capture you would need if you eliminated some renewable energy. You need carbon capture no matter what, but you also need more if you have less renewable energy built. And also how much land you need to conserve in order for that carbon capture or carbon storage. So again, it's not an either or scenario. And then coming from a bird perspective and from a bat perspective, fossil fuels are incredibly detrimental. Oil rigs off the coast of, in the Gulf of Mexico are lethal to birds. Birds migrating, a lot of land birds rely on the Gulf of Mexico to migrate. And they get stuck at the oil rigs. The lighting brings them in, or the structure makes them think that it's a good place to stop over, and then they've expended their energy and they don't make it all the way to the coast. The turbines, most of the construction and operation plans for these turbines are intending to use ADLS systems, or aircraft detection lighting systems. So the lights on the turbines that are using that system only go on as an aircraft is approaching. I grew up I'm originally from California, I'm sorry, and I grew up going to Carpinteria, which is this very fancy beach community south of Santa Barbara. And I could see oil rigs from shore, and I could see the little twinkly lights, and not knowing what I was looking at, I thought they were very pretty. And so I'd much rather be, just from a personal perspective, much rather be seeing turbines. And it just wasn't that was a consistent light that you saw at nighttime. So fossil fuels certainly have environmental impacts for birds and bats.
So very quick follow-up question. In terms of transmission, could we spend a couple of minutes just talking about that? There were a number of questions about the implications of transmission and also whether our grid will be able to keep up with the connection of these turbines. And I know, Tim, it's in our area of work, that's something that we talk a lot about, and also, Amber, in terms of how important it is that we're also looking at the impacts of transmission.
I hope there'll be some help on this question. Transmission is as important as siting the wind turbines. I learned today that in the U.S. we unfortunately separated the siting of the turbines and the transmission, and in other places it's all done by their federal governments. So I think it's whatever, it should be carefully done. I think there are impacts that are studied and measured and are trying to be abated, that are being worked on. I think you probably have more to add.
I'll just add, so on an information side, the transmission coming from the project to shore will be buried, so it needs to be 6 feet beneath the seafloor. I mean, that needs to also be monitored and tended to over time. But the transmission impact, the siting of that transmission line, is something that we evaluate in project evaluation and at the earliest stages of identifying responsible areas for lease areas to be placed is consideration for where will that power come ashore, what are the interconnect opportunities, particularly here in New England, we're fairly limited in interconnect opportunities. So as the talk about scaling up offshore wind, as the numbers of megawatts go up that we hope to see generated offshore, ultimately the need for planning what that transmission will look like has become very important, because only so much power fits on a transmission line. There's only so many places that it can plug into where an area of the coast is industrially zoned and can handle that kind of substation construction. And there's a ton of environmental evaluation associated with the line and the substation and the interconnect. And ultimately, to the question of whether our grid can handle it, I mean, that's one of the many challenges I think that keeps offshore wind advocates and developers up at night, is that no, our grid cannot handle the scale of offshore wind development that we're talking about, and that is something that needs to be resolved imminently. It's something that New England is really leading on, given that we are sort of at the forefront of offshore wind development, with the furthest along in that leasing and permitting timeline. So the New England states are working together right now on a transmission initiative to identify both the land-based upgrades that are needed, as well as better approaches to transmission planning. But as you can imagine, it's really an ongoing challenge, because as recently as 5 years ago, we were just talking about a handful of projects here and there along the coast. Now we have this 45 gigawatt goal nationally. So that really raised the stakes of what the grid needs to be able to take on. With the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act last year, there's a lot of new resources dedicated to building transmission and upgrading transmission infrastructure. So it's a very hot topic right now.
Great. So this next question is about how NOAA has authorized or is in the process of authorizing takes of over 500,000 marine mammals. Takes are granted when an activity has a high likelihood of harming or disturbing these animals. This implies the understanding that harm will be anticipated. The question asks why the developers are not being more upfront. We don't have developers here tonight, but I did want to invite the panel to comment on takes.
Takes under either the Marine Mammal Protection Act or the Endangered Species Act include an entire range of things, from killing all the way down to annoying. And basically, the permits that have been issued to date are to annoy whales. They're not to harm them, they're not to make them deaf, they're not to cause any permanent injury or to kill any, it's just to bother them. So using the word takes and putting the quotes around it is just scare tactics.
I just like to jump. Please.
Sure, can we just stick around? You can talk about it.
Yeah.
That take includes the range of things. So
Takes under the law includes the range, but under the permits that have been issued, the only permits issued are for level B harassment, which is annoying them.
Under the law, the permit only says annoyance level harassment.
It says level B harassment, that's all.
So we have about 3 minutes. We're going to try to get to one or two more questions, and then again, being respectful of your time, and really glad you've stuck through the 2-hour event with us. But Captain Monty, please go ahead.
I just equate it to if you're at a rock concert and the speaker goes on, you're annoyed. You move away from the speaker, and that we experienced out at Block Island, particularly with the pile driving, which was extremely annoying to fish. There were no fish in the area when the Block Island wind farm was built, but it was temporary. Once the construction was complete, the fish came back, and as I shared, in greater abundance than before because of the habitat creation. So there are a lot of things that are going to annoy fish and mammals, but they are temporary, and quite frankly, they move away from the area, not to be annoying, but do come back.
And now I want to just quickly shift in the last 2 minutes that we have to talk about jobs. There were a number of questions based on the economic side of offshore wind projects. So Mike Rose, I'm looking at you. I actually really appreciate some of these note cards that say labor guy. So thinking about the jobs that are being promised by developers, there's a lot of questions about, is it really that many jobs? How can we ensure that we're holding them accountable? And also, are we better off for those jobs? Are we losing other jobs in a different industry? So really, if you could just talk for a couple minutes about like the job economic side, and from your perspective, how you're looking at the offshore wind industry and also holding them accountable.
Holding management and bosses and corporations accountable is why the labor movement exists. And I can tell you that is our number one goal as Climate Jobs, is to hold developers accountable to their prospects of jobs. Not only that, but making sure this isn't a race to the bottom. There's a real risk when you're investing in new technology that shady developers will come in and offer shoddy wages, take some guy off the street who, doesn't know exactly how to drill a bolt in and pay him, minimum wage. That's not what this work is supposed to be. And so what we exist to do is to make sure that we're raising that floor and making sure that we're holding developers accountable. And we don't use employer-based in terms of developers, corporations. We use independent research, and we had a great partnership with folks at the Worker Institute at Cornell University to model out those projections for us that are in this report. So that's I'm all about holding corporations and employers accountable. I'm here for the workers.
Thank you again to our panelists. A strong round of applause for them. We can't thank you enough for your time and your expertise. Now I'm going to kick it over to Rep. McGraw to close the program out.
Thank you so much for all of you that stuck it out to the end. I know it was a lot of information to take in. Again, I want to thank our panelists. Thank you so much for volunteering your time tonight. I know it's a long way out here to visit us in Little Compton, and I really appreciate you spending the evening with us as an opportunity to share some of your knowledge with us. And thank you to our hosts, Priscilla and to Amanda for emceeing the evening. I apologize that we weren't able to get to everyone's questions, but again, we will put together an FAQ based upon the information that was provided. Any industry questions we'll be forwarding to the industry so that they can answer your specific questions. It sounds like I have a few take-homes. I'm going to be providing you a link to the YouTube video. Once that is available, I will provide information to the slide presentation. We're going to put together that FAQ sheet for everyone. And so I will have all of that information on my website, and the presentation, the YouTube video will also be on the Audubon Society's YouTube channel. Please be patient with me. I'm working a full-time job, and I have session every night this week. at the State House, so there'll be some late nights. So that information might not be posted till next week, but I appreciate your patience in that. And again, thank you all for coming, and have a good night.